If you ask a mechanic what a mechanic is, 9 times out of 10, that individual is going to be able to answer that question in just a couple of sentences. The same thing applies to most occupations or identities. So whether you're talking about a nurse, an office manager, a janitor, a dentist, a pastor, a counselor, individuals will be able to answer that question within a few sentences. This has not been the case with a particular group of individuals who are on social media and particularly on this platform. And this group involves those identifying as Moors or those who are talking about Moors. And so self-identification is the most important type of identification. It's more important than how other people identify someone. And so it's also very important when people are asked who they are or what they are talking about, that people be able to and be willing to be clear and concise about what that is. And so what has happened is when the topic of Moors comes up or Moor comes up, and the question is asked of individuals, what are you talking about? What is a Moor? How do you define that? There is generally not a response. There is a response, but it's not an actual answer. And so what generally happens is a referral to go and look at other videos or other reading materials, but there is a lack of a response that is edifying, that is educating, that actually answers the question. And this is a very important question because what you have going on is this dynamic whereby individuals are asserting that there's a conflation going on with what is identified as Moor and every indigenous identity on the planet. So the indigenous people of the Americas, the indigenous people of Europe, the indigenous people of Asia, of the islands. And so there is that claim out there. And there's also a claim to just about every religion that exists. There is a focus on one, but there is a claim to just about every religion, again, that is in existence. And as many may be aware, the word Moor involves this dynamic known as polysemy. So there are multiple meanings related to this particular word, and then there are various iterations in terms of spellings of the word, the way you pronounce this construct. And so it makes it very important that people be willing to have open, honest, and direct dialogue related to a word, a construct, and an identity. And so before we go any further with any further discussion that might touch or concern this identity of Moor, we are going to ask some questions and give people other than those identifying as Moor the opportunity to share their insights in the comment section. And so perhaps we will get to a better understanding and a consensus perhaps related to this particular identity. If you ask someone what an African American is, you'll usually get a concise response. However, this is not the case with this identity, and so we want to get concise. And what you can see on the screen are comments related to Moor or Moorish identity. And these are comments, and often the comments come in response to questions. And the question is pretty consistent. Thank you for sharing your reflections. What is a Moor? However, there is generally no direct answer. And these are also some comments that are on other discussions, not this particular channel, but on other discussions where the dynamic of Moors and American Indians come up, and there's some conflating going on. And so the discussions are all over the place related to this single identity, and many of the discussions are extremely esoteric. And so if you ask, who are the Joneses in terms of a family, people can generally tell you. And it doesn't necessarily involve a religious explanation. It's usually related to biology, genealogy. However, when you're talking about this particular group, the conversations are all over the place. There is no coherent, well-constructed discussion that is edifying related to this identity that apparently is understood as impacting all of the continents. And one of the most challenging things is that there is this sort of bait and switch dynamic going on where there will be a discussion about one thing, and somehow that discussion morphs into then including this particular identity in the dynamic. And so it could start off talking about quote unquote American Indians or Europeans or West Africans or East Africans or Asians, Hebrews. It doesn't matter. Somehow or another, the conversation, the discussion, the teaching often morphs into this conflation. And then when there's an attempt to disentangle all of that, there is resistance to that with a lot of esoteric, rhetorical communication. So to gain more clarity, we are going to ask more pointed questions. Sometimes it doesn't help when things feel confusing for certain individuals to ask very open-ended questions, and sometimes more pointed questions are more helpful in terms of getting a more clear and concise response. And so we're going to ask some very pointed questions related to some assertions that are out there to try to get a little bit more clarity here. So there is the assertion that those identifying as Moors have an indigenous Scythian heritage, that there is an origin in terms of being Iranian around the Black Sea area. There is an assertion that the heritage may be more related to Central Asia. Also being a Scythian mercenary type of dynamic. And also with a variety of other iterations in terms of names for different groups. And so you have the Sith and the Saka and the Sake and the Sai. I mean, so there are a variety. And so the question is this the understanding that people have who are Moors? Do they understand themselves as having any of this? Is this their reality? Also an assertion about being Eurasian nomads. Also similar to the Fula, people know as Fulani, the Hausa, the Mandi. Is that the origin? There's also an assertion that the origin is very, very ancient, and it's related to Western Central Eurasian steppe, starting at the 9th century BC. There's also the question of whether the Moors are the Mongols. There's also the question, and this is often asserted, pretty much on the surface, that the Moors are the Berbers, also known as Barbary and barbarians. And so this also comes out of India related to this. There's also an assertion by individuals who discuss Moorish heritage of being out of Lemuria, the mythological continental space island known as Lemuria. So there are a variety of assertions out there, and these are the very specific questions we're going to be answering in this particular discussion in the comment section. Another question is, do Moors understand themselves historically as those individuals known as Goths or Jata or Goth? Also Yuchi, and that's also the same name, that's in Chinese, but that's also the same name that goes with an American Indian tribe or nation. And so do any of these names, these iterations on the screen, are those emblematic of those identified as Moor? Regardless of the iteration of Moor, is any of this related to Moor identity? Are Moors identified as any of the individuals seen on the screen? Now, interestingly, the one in the middle looks remarkably like what is stereotypically understood as an American Indian persona. However, this is not supposed to be a depiction of American Indians. Is Moor tied to any of the identities that are seen on the screen? Is the understanding of Moor tied to any of the depictions that are seen on this particular screen? Is Moor tied to any of the identities seen on this screen? And for clarity, these are individuals in India. Is Moor tied to any of the identities on this screen? Now, these are depictions that are common in terms of Moor, and many people understand these individuals to be Moor when they see them. And so the question becomes, what does this depiction mean? What do these depictions mean in terms of understanding what it means to be a Moor? What is the understanding of what it means to be a Moor? And so you're looking at the external here. However, there are a number of commonalities related to the individuals. And so you can see a number of dynamics related to dress, related to carriage, related to, again, skin color in some instances, hair covering, and so feathers, and a particular type of feather. And so what does this mean when you see this? What does it mean in terms of your understanding of what a Moor is across continents? When individuals talk about being a Moor, or individuals are talking about Moors, are they talking about the Mauryan Empire from India? And this was an ancient empire that interestingly had a river known as Ganga. And so is this what is being discussed? We understand that there's often a conflation between Moor and Islam. However, there also is a conflation related to Buddhism. And so are you talking about this dynamic? Are you talking about the Mauryan Empire? Are you talking about Moors actually being Buddhist or Hindu? So what exactly are individuals talking about when they are identifying individuals as Moors, or they are talking about themselves in that way? Is being a Moor tied to architecture such as this in India, the Sheesh Mahal? Is this a part of being a Moor? Is Moor tied to being indigenous to areas that have the name Mar in India? And so is that a part of the indigenous heritage of Moors? Are any of these Mar villages in India tied to the indigenous heritage of those understanding themselves as Moor, or others who understand people as Moor? Are any of these Indian villages related to the identity of Moor in terms of that indigenous heritage? Are any of these Indian villages related to the understanding of the indigenous heritage of Moors? Are any of these villages related to the understanding of the indigenous heritage of Moors? And also, is it anyone's understanding that the peacock symbolizes the indigenous heritage of the Moors? And finally, are any of these Indian villages related to the understanding of the indigenous heritage of Moors? And as we wrap this up, we're going to get a little bit more clarity here related to the idea of indigenous. And so indigenous means that the entity originated in that space, sprung up from that space. It's sort of like ostriches. Ostriches are indigenous. They sprung up, as far as we know, in Africa. And so they are not indigenous to the Americas, as far as we know. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about indigenous. We're not talking about, are all animals indigenous to the planet? And so we're not talking about, are all human beings indigenous to the entire planet? And so we're talking about social ethnic grouping. And so if people need a little bit more specificity, we can talk about the individuals who went in and conquered Spain and Portugal. Were those individuals indigenous to Spain and Portugal prior to the conquering? Did they come to Spain and Portugal, or were they already there from the beginning of time? And so hopefully that makes a little bit more sense, because oftentimes when people are being very esoteric, there's this dynamic whereby you cannot get an answer to the question because the response is something along the lines of Moors are indigenous to the entire planet. And so that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for specific social and ethnic groups. Prior to that particular social ethnic group, that family, that smaller clan, prior to them arriving wherever they are, was there anyone else there? Any other family there? Any other, were the Joneses there? The Smiths there? Was there any other grouping there prior to the individuals emerging from that space? Or were the groups from some other place? And finally, going along with this idea of Moors being Indo-Aryan Scythian, this assertion also keeps coming up that all of these different places with M-A-R and M-O-R and M-U-R, that all of those places are really outgrowths of this original dynamic. And so the question is, are individuals asserting that places such as Morocco, Mauritania, Marrakesh, are Marika or Marika, America, are individuals asserting that all of these entities are in fact colonies of this Indo-Aryan, Scythian, Indian sort of empire? Now, the comment section is reserved for those individuals who are seeking clarity and who want to offer information, open, direct, and honest information. This is not a space for deeply esoteric dynamics. We're looking for those answers such as, what is a mechanic? Okay, and so answers to these questions need to be open, direct, and honest. Referring individuals to external readings and external materials, that's not appropriate for this particular dynamic that we're going to have related to this particular discussion. Also, blanket and rhetorical responses are also not acceptable in this particular discussion. And remember, knowledge is nothing if you do not have both wisdom and understanding related to the knowledge that you possess.